I'm 73 years old today. Saying it out loud still causes me a certain amazement, as if this age doesn't suit me or the way I've always felt inside. When I look in the mirror, I see wrinkles, white hair, and hands marked by time, but inside me still lives someone who learned early to obey and too late to question. This story doesn't start now, but it's now that I finally get to tell it. For almost my entire life, I believed what I was told. I believed it when they said it was normal to let go of what I felt. I believed it when they said that obeying was a sign of respect, and that being silent was a proof of love. These ideas were repeated so many times that they stopped sounding like orders, and came to seem like absolute truths. For a long time, I didn't even realize that something was wrong. I just followed. I followed rules that I didn't help create, decisions that I didn't fully understand, and paths that others chose for me. And somehow, I thought that was the right thing. After all, who was I to question people older, more experienced, more confident than me? Today, looking back, I see that this obedience was not an isolated episode. It has become a way of life, a constant posture, a way to exist in the world without causing discomfort, without creating conflicts, without taking up too much space. I learned to be small, even when I was an adult. The hardest thing to admit is that no one had to force me after a certain point. I policed myself. I silenced myself before any word escaped. It was automatic, a habit so ingrained that it felt like part of my personality, when in fact it was just the result of years of being controlled. I was often praised for that. They said I was easy to deal with, understanding, patient. They said I had a good heart. I smiled, thanked, and kept to myself that strange feeling of always giving in, always giving up, always being last. But I believed that was the way it should be. I never stopped to think about the consequences. At the time, no one talked about emotional consequences, about what happens when a person spends their entire life ignoring their own voice. The focus was always on the now. Do this, accept that, don't complicate it. The future never seemed to matter. I built entire relationships based on this logic. Friends, family, marriage. In all of them, I molded myself according to the expectations of the other. I believed that if I was obedient enough, I would be loved enough. That if it didn't cause problems, everything would be fine. But it didn't. Something inside me began to be lost. Slowly, almost imperceptibly. It was not a sudden pain, nor a blatant suffering. It was a slow erasure, a forgetfulness of who I was, what I felt, what I desired. And for many years, I didn't even know how to name it. Today, at 73, I can see more clearly. I can look at my story honestly, even if it hurts. I know I obeyed too much. I know I kept quiet when I needed to speak. And I know that this silence shaped everything that came after. Telling this now is not an attempt to blame anyone. It's an attempt to finally listen to me, to recognize that that woman who spent decades believing in others also deserved to be heard. Even if this understanding came late, this is the story of how I took orders without understanding the consequences, and how it took me a lifetime to realize the price of that. The fact that you have chosen to hear this story so far already says a lot about you. What comes next isn't just personal. It's a silent truth that many people carry with them for their entire lives. If you believe that stories like this deserve to continue being told, subscribe to the channel because they are not just about me. They are about all of us. I was born in a small town where the streets were too quiet to hide what was happening inside the houses. Mine was in a simple neighborhood with similar houses, low walls, and predictable routines. There was no luxury, but there was no mess either. Everything worked like clockwork. Schedules, rules, customs. From an early age, I understood that living there meant fitting in. Inside the house, silence had weight. It was not an empty silence, but full of expectation. Conversations were measured, opinions filtered, and children quickly learned that talking too much could lead to problems. I watched more than I asked, and when I asked, I could see on their faces that it was not welcome. My father was a serious man, one of those who believed that authority does not need to be explained, he decided. And that was it. He didn't usually raise his voice, which made everything even more definitive. When he said something, there was no room for doubt. Questioning seemed like a serious mistake, almost a lack of character. I learned to agree before I even understood. My mother lived for the house and the family. She did everything efficiently, but rarely with visible joy. He didn't complain. He didn't disagree. He didn't confront him. When something bothered her, she just moved on. I saw that every day and understood, without anyone having to teach me, that this was the role of a correct woman. I don't remember conversations about feelings. No one asked if I was sad, confused, or afraid. The important thing was if I was behaved. Emotion was not a priority. I learned to swallow tears, to smile politely, and to keep questions that would not have an answer. At school, this behavior was rewarded. I was the exemplary student, the easy child, the one who didn't give me any trouble. Adults liked me for that, and each compliment reinforced the idea that I was right to shut up. Being seen as good was more important than being truthful. When something hurt me, I didn't speak up. Not because it was forbidden, but because it didn't seem necessary. There was always someone in a worse situation, some bigger problem, some reason for me not to complain. I learned that my feelings took up too much space for the little value they had. Over time, I began to anticipate orders. Before anyone even asked, I was ready to obey. This gave me a false sense of control. I believed that if I was quick to accept, I would avoid conflict. And avoiding conflict has become a silent mission of my life. There has never been a major episode that justified all this. There were no constant screams, no dramatic scenes. It was precisely this normality that made everything more confusing. The control was disguised as care, silence, of education, and I grew up believing that it was love. Gradually, I lost track of what I really wanted. My will seemed fragile, unimportant, easily disposable. I molded myself according to the environment, as if I had no contour of my own, and no one seemed to find this strange. Today, I understand that that house taught me much more than rules. She taught me to disappear without anyone noticing, to exist without bothering, to obey as a form of emotional survival. It was there, in that seemingly ordinary childhood, that I learned to be quiet, not out of explicit fear, but out of habit. A habit that accompanied me when I grew up, when I left home, and when I built my own life. I didn't know it at the time, but that learning would be the basis of all the decisions that I would accept without understanding, and the beginning of a story that would take decades for me to be able to tell. When I think of my mother, the first image that comes to mind is that of her in motion, always doing something, always busy, always available. It seemed to exist only to fulfill tasks and meet needs. He rarely sat down without a practical reason. Resting was not part of her routine, and I grew up believing that this should not be part of mine either. She was not a tough woman in the classical sense. He didn't yell at me, he didn't hit me, he didn't threaten me. On the contrary, she was calm, almost always serene. But there was a quiet sadness about her that I didn't recognize until many years later. At the time, I just absorbed that behavior as a role model. My mother never questioned my father. When he spoke, she nodded. When she decided something, she executed it. Even when he disagreed, he did so in silence. Sometimes I noticed a suppressed sigh, a distant look, but nothing more. It was as if she had learned that speaking would not change anything. She taught me more by example than by words. He never directly said that I needed to be quiet, but he showed it every day. When I complained about something, she said not to create a problem. When I was sad, I said that it would pass. When I showed doubt, I said that the older ones knew what they were doing. There was always a sentence ready to end any attempt at deeper conversation. That's just how it is. Better not mess with it, except that it hurts less. These phrases were accumulating inside me like invisible rules that I started to follow without realizing it. I wanted to please her. She wanted to be the daughter who didn't give her work, who made her life easier, who didn't add weight to the already tiring days. So I started to hide what I felt. I kept my questions, my desires, my fears. I did this thinking I was helping. Over time, I realized that my mother also did this to herself. She swallowed frustrations, accepted unfair situations, and moved on as if it were normal. I saw it, but I didn't understand. Today, I understand that she was also raised like this. In a world where women did not choose, they just adapted. There was no room for honest conversations between us. We talked about tasks, commitments, obligations, never about dreams, never be afraid, never about what could be different. Life was something to be endured, not questioned. I grew up thinking that this was strength, to endure in silence. What maturity it was not to bother, what love it was to give in. These ideas took root so deeply that they came to define who I was, without even realizing it. Sometimes I wonder if my mother realized what she was teaching me, if at any time she felt guilt or doubt, but we never talked about it. Our silence has always been stronger than any attempt at rapprochement. Today, I don't blame her. I know she did what she knew how to do, with the tools she had. But acknowledging this does not erase the effect it had on me. It was from her that I learned that being quiet was safer than talking. This learning accompanied me out of the home, into adulthood, to all the relationships I built afterwards. My mother's voice, asking for calm and acceptance, continued to echo within me for many years. That's how silence went from being just an occasional choice to becoming a part of who I was. An invisible heritage, passed from mother to daughter, unintentionally, but with profound consequences. The first orders that I didn't understand didn't arrive abruptly. They came disguised as guidance, advice, care. They were phrases said naturally, as if there was no other option but to agree. I was still too young to realize that this wasn't just help, it was imposed direction. In the beginning, they were small decisions. What to wear, who to walk with, where to go. There was always someone older saying what was appropriate, what looked best, what made the most sense. When I tried to argue, the answer came quickly. You still don't know how the world works. And I believed it. I remember feeling a silent confusion inside me. It was not exactly revolt, but a nuisance that was difficult to explain. Something between doubt and fear. I didn't understand why my desires always seemed less important than those of others, but I also didn't know how to express it. Whenever I hesitated, someone else decided for me. They said it was to make it easier, to protect me, to avoid mistakes. I listened and accepted. After all, making mistakes seemed too serious. Better to trust those who knew better. These orders were not accompanied by in-depth explanations. No one bothered to help me understand the reason for the choices. The important thing was to obey. Understanding was secondary. And, over time, I stopped trying to understand. I began to associate doubt with problem, questioning with ingratitude. If I asked too much, I felt that I was being difficult, inconvenient. Then I quickly agreed, even when something inside me silently resisted. The curious thing is that I didn't exactly feel unhappy at that moment. I felt confused, but safe. Safe because someone was in control. Safe because she didn't have to take responsibility for her choices. This false security kept me trapped for a long time. There were times when I wondered what it would be like to choose on my own, to think calmly, to decide based on what I felt. But these ideas seemed distant, almost forbidden. They didn't match the way I was raised. Each order accepted without understanding reinforced a pattern. I became more and more dependent on the approval of others. I needed someone to say if it was right, if it was good, if it was acceptable. My own opinion seemed insufficient. Over the years, these small imposed decisions have piled up. They built a path that I followed without realizing that I had not chosen. And the more I walked through it, the harder it seemed to get out. No one ever asked me if I was comfortable with it. And I never asked myself either. The idea of stopping and reflecting was not part of my reality. Life just happened, and I kept up. Today, I understand that those first orders were the rehearsal for something bigger. They taught me to accept without understanding, to agree without feeling, to follow without questioning. And this shaped much more than punctual decisions. That's how I learned that understanding wasn't necessary to obey. All you had to do was trust, lower your head and move on. I didn't know it yet, but this habit would lead me to the most important decision of my life, the one that would change everything. The decision that changed everything was not accompanied by fanfare. There was no long discussion, no room for opinion. It was presented as a fait accompli, something already settled among adults. While I just listened, I remember the calm tone with which they spoke, as if it were too simple to make any impact. I was young, but I understood enough to feel that something was wrong. Still, I remained seated, with my hands clasped in my lap, listening to each word as if watching one's own life being organized by others. They said it was the best for me, that I would understand over time, that it was necessary. When I tried to say I wasn't sure, someone interrupted me. "You don't have to understand now." That phrase stuck with me. It sounded definitive, as if my understanding was not relevant, as if my life could go on without me participating in it. Other phrases followed, spoken firmly and calmly. "Trust us. This is for your good. Don't complicate things." Every word seemed to close a door inside me. I felt like asking more, but something stopped me. An old fear, already known. I looked at my mother, expecting some sign, some silent support. She didn't look back at me. He just agreed, as he always did. At that moment, I understood that there was nowhere to go. The path was already mapped out, and I should just follow it. The silence that settled afterwards was heavy. No one asked how I felt. No one noticed the lump in my throat, the confusion that took over my head. That decision was normalized so quickly that it felt wrong to feel any discomfort. I convinced myself that I was exaggerating. I told myself that everyone knew what they were doing, that I was too young to grasp the implications, that questioning would only bring problems. And so, I accepted. That was the moment when something inside me closed. Not abruptly, but definitively. I learned there that my opinion had no weight when confronted with the authority of others, and that insisting would be useless. As the days passed, the decision began to come true. The people around acted as if nothing extraordinary had happened. For them, everything was solved. For me, something had been ripped out, even if I didn't know exactly what. I didn't cry, I didn't complain, I didn't protest. I fulfilled the role they expected of me. On the outside, she seemed calm. Inside, something broke in silence. I was learning, once again, that being quiet was the safest option. Today, I recognize that moment as the first major breaking point of my life. Not because someone was cruel in an obvious way, but because my voice was removed naturally. And this left deep marks. Accepting that decision without understanding the consequences set me on a path that would be difficult to get out of. A path made of obedience, renunciation, and silence. And without knowing it, I had just taken the step that would define everything that would come after. After that decision, something changed in me quietly, but permanently. It wasn't a change that anyone from the outside could notice. I continued to fulfill my days, my obligations, my roles. But, inside, I began to adjust my behavior so as not to feel that discomfort of wanting to speak and not being able to again. I quickly learned that asking didn't bring relief. On the contrary, it seemed only to prolong the feeling of inadequacy. Each time a doubt arose, I swallowed it before I could even put it into words. It was as if my mind had created an automatic filter to avoid conflicts. I started to observe more and talk less. I observed what others expected of me, how they behaved, what decisions were considered correct. And then I adapted. This constant effort to fit in gave me a strange sense of security, as if I was doing everything the right way. The people around me seemed pleased with that. They said I was mature, responsible, easy to deal with. These compliments reinforced the behavior. I felt validated not by who I was, but by how much I could shape myself. And I confess that this gave me some comfort at that moment. Over time, my own opinions began to seem distant. When someone asked me what I wanted, I took a long time to answer. Not because of shyness, but because I really didn't know. I had spent so much time accepting decisions that I had unlearned how to choose. Asking required courage, and I didn't feel brave. Questioning meant running the risk of displeasing, of seeming ungrateful, of being seen as problematic. I didn't want that. I wanted to continue to be accepted, approved, respected, even if the price was silence. I began to realize that my life followed a predictable script. Each step led to the next without much thought. I just followed, as I had always done. And the more time passed, the harder it seemed to stop and think about whether that path made sense. There were times when a restlessness would arise, especially at night when everything was quiet. Questions tried to emerge, but I quickly pushed them away. I told myself that it was too late to think about it, that there was no point in messing with what was decided. I became an expert at justifying what I didn't understand. I found explanations for other people's decisions, defended choices that were not mine, and convinced myself that everything had a reason. This skill helped me move forward, but it also pushed me away from myself. Gradually, asking is no longer an option. It became something strange, almost dangerous. I associated questions with confusion, pain, discomfort, so I chose the apparent clarity of silence, even though I knew deep down that it was fragile. No one has ever explicitly told me to stop asking. It was a decision I made alone, based on everything I had learned so far. A self-protective decision, even if I didn't recognize it that way at the time. Today, I understand that learning not to ask was one of the most profound lessons of my life. It kept me safe for a while, but it also kept me stuck with choices I didn't understand and a role I didn't question. This is how silence ceased to be just an occasional response and became an internal rule. A rule that would accompany me for many years, influencing every decision, every relationship, and every piece of life that I would still build. When marriage came into my life, it didn't come as a thoughtful choice, but as a natural next step. It was what was expected of me at that age. People spoke as if it were something obvious, almost automatic, and I accepted, as I always did, trusting that others knew what was best. I don't remember ever stopping to think if this was really the man I wanted by my side. He seemed adequate, hardworking, serious, respected. These qualities were enough for everyone to approve, and the approval of others has always been too important a criterion for me. During the courtship, I already avoided disagreeing. He preferred to give in to creating tension. If something bothered me, I kept it. I thought that every relationship required sacrifice and that my role was to make things easier. Love for me has always been linked to the idea of adaptation. After the wedding, this pattern only deepened. Decisions were made naturally by him, and I followed. Not because he imposed it on me explicitly, but because I was already trained for it. I anticipated expectations, adjusted behaviors, silenced desires. I was often told I was lucky, that my marriage was peaceful, without major fights. And it was true. We didn't fight, but we also didn't talk about what really mattered. The absence of conflict was seen as a sign of success, when in fact it was just a lack of voice. I became an expert at keeping the peace. If something bothered me, I solved it on my own or simply accepted it. He avoided any situation that could generate discomfort. Over time, I no longer knew how to differentiate between what was a healthy concession and what was an annulment. There were times when I felt invisible inside my own home, not out of malice, but out of habit. Everyone was used to me adapting, and I kept reinforcing that role, believing that this was what a good wife should look like. I was never asked what I wanted for myself. And to be honest, I wouldn't know how to answer either. My desires were so buried that they seemed to no longer exist. I worked in automatic mode, fulfilling tasks, responsibilities, and expectations. Over the years, this dynamic has become normal. I didn't feel revolt, just a tiredness that was difficult to explain. A tiredness that did not come from physical work, but from the constant need to mold myself, to adjust, not to bother. I believed that this constant effort was love, that giving up was proof of maturity, that being quiet was a sign of strength. These beliefs kept me there for a long time, even when something inside me called for change. Today, I realize that that marriage was not built on conscious choices, but on old patterns. I repeated, without realizing it, everything I had learned in childhood. I only changed the authority figures. I don't blame anyone for that, not even myself, at the time. I did what I knew how to do, but recognizing this pattern now helps me understand why I felt so lost for so many years. It was in this marriage, silent and apparently stable, that my obedience was consolidated as an identity. And it was also there that I began to lose, little by little, the notion of who I really was. As time went by, I realized that being useful became the safest way to exist. The more I did for others, the less I needed to explain who I was. Solving problems, anticipating needs, and accomplishing tasks gave me a definite place in the world. I didn't have to talk about feelings when I was always busy. In my house, I was the one who kept everything running. The meals, the organization, the schedules, the details that no one noticed, but that made all the difference. This earned me occasional compliments and, above all, the feeling of being needed. Being needed was better than being seen. I got used to measuring my worth by how much I could do. When someone needed help, I was there. When an unforeseen event arose, I solved it. Saying no never seemed like an option. After all, if I refused, who would I be? This constant availability did not come without cost. I was often tired, but I kept going. Sad, but smile. Confused, but she moved on. I learned to ignore the signals of my own body and my emotions, treating everything as something secondary. People started to count on me automatically. I was the silent base of everything, and in a way, I fed it myself. The more I did, the less they expected me to ask for something in return. This unequal exchange has become normal. There was a quiet pride in being seen as strong. I told myself that I could handle it, that I didn't need help. Recognizing limits seemed like weakness, and I had spent my whole life trying to prove that I was strong. When someone asked how I was doing, I would answer well without thinking. The answer came out automatically, even when it was not true. It wasn't a conscious lie, it was habit. I no longer knew how to explain what I felt, nor if anyone really wanted to hear it. Over time, I began to feel that I existed only in the function I performed. Outside of it, I didn't know who it was. He had no hobbies, clear dreams, or desires of his own. My identity was completely tied to what I offered to others. At times, a strange sensation arose, as if something was missing, but I couldn't identify what. It was a discreet emptiness, easy to ignore in the midst of daily obligations. And I ignored it, because that's what I've always done. I believed that this life was the natural result of the choices I had made. I never considered that maybe I had never really chosen. This possibility still seemed too distant to be faced. Being helpful kept me busy, respected, and needed, but it also kept me imprisoned, stuck in a role I didn't know how to leave without feeling guilty or afraid. Today, I can see that, by transforming utility into identity, I gradually erased myself. Not for lack of capacity, but for over-adaptation. I became everything to others, while ceasing to be someone to myself. This pattern would continue with me for many years, until something finally forced me to stop. And when I stopped, I realized how much I had left behind without even noticing. Guilt began to appear without warning and without clear explanation. I did everything that was expected of me, fulfilled my roles, attended to the needs of others, and yet carried a constant weight on my chest. I couldn't say exactly what I felt guilty about. I just felt. It was a silent guilt, which did not manifest itself in major crises. She was in the little things, in the discomfort of resting, in the feeling of owing something even when everything was in order. I felt missing without knowing with whom or why. When something didn't go as planned, The first reaction was to take responsibility. Even when it didn't depend on me, I wondered where I had gone wrong. This habit was automatic. Taking the blame seemed easier than questioning the system I lived in. I compared myself a lot with others. There was always someone who seemed to handle everything better than I could. Someone more willing, more excited, more satisfied. I looked at these people and concluded that the problem was in me, never in the circumstances. This guilt also prevented me from wanting more. Whenever I thought of something different for me, a feeling of selfishness came with it, as if wanting something of my own was wrong, exaggerated or unfair to those around me. I often apologized unnecessarily. Sorry for talking too much, for getting tired, for needing something. The apology became a reflex. I occupied space with excessive care, as if my presence needed to be constantly justified. There was no specific time when this guilt had begun. It was formed little by little, fed by years of silence, adaptation, and renunciation. When I realized it was already part of me, like a permanent background of sadness. I didn't talk about it with anyone. How to explain a fault without a concrete reason? How can I say that I felt wrong even though I did everything right? So I kept it, as I always did. At night, when the house was quiet, this feeling became stronger. It was in these moments that the emptiness appeared most clearly. An emptiness accompanied by a question that I avoided answering. Why did I never feel enough? I tried to push away these thoughts by busying myself even more. More tasks, more commitments, more responsibilities. The constant movement was a way of not feeling, and it worked, at least for a while. But the guilt did not disappear. She just hid, waiting for a moment of silence to reappear. I began to realize that something was deeply wrong, even though I couldn't identify what. Today, I understand that this was not my fault. She was the result of a lifetime living to correspond, never to exist. But at that time, I didn't have that clarity. I just carried the weight, thinking it was part of who I was. This nameless guilt was one of the deepest marks of my obedience, invisible to others, but constant inside me. And she would follow me for many years until something finally broke that cycle. My body started talking before I was ready to listen. It was not dramatic nor sudden. They were small signs, easy to ignore at first. A tiredness that didn't go away, a lack of enthusiasm when I woke up, a constant feeling of heaviness that I couldn't explain. I woke up already tired, as if I hadn't really rested. Even after a full night's sleep, something in me remained exhausted. Still, I got up and followed. I always followed. Resting seemed like a luxury I wasn't entitled to. There were days when my body asked for a break, but my mind responded with obligation. I told myself that it was normal, that it was age, that it was routine. It was easier to believe this than to accept that something deeper was happening. I began to feel a discreet sadness, for no apparent reason. It was not desperation, nor something that drew attention. It was a low, constant sadness, like a silent background that accompanied everything I did. I learned to live with her without questioning. My body also felt more sensitive. Small frustrations shook me more than before, although I didn't show it. I kept smiling, fulfilling commitments, being useful. On the outside, nothing looked different. Inside, I was increasingly distant from myself. Sometimes, I felt a huge desire to cry without knowing the reason. The tears came to my eyes and I held them, as I always did. I didn't want to bother anyone with something that I didn't even know how to explain properly. I noticed that my body reacted to what I didn't say, to the decisions accepted, to the words swallowed, to the wills ignored. It was as if he was carrying everything that I never put out. Even so, I insisted on not listening. He said it was weakness, that I needed to be more grateful, stronger. After all, so many people had more difficult lives. Who was I to complain? Over time, I began to avoid moments of silence. The silence brought me face to face with myself, and that bothered me. I'd rather be busy, on the go, solving something for someone. There was a constant feeling of being trapped, even without visible bars, stuck in a routine, in expectations, in a version of myself that I no longer knew how to sustain. But I had no words for it. Then he moved on. My body became a storehouse of everything I didn't express. He felt it before me, warned before me, but I wasn't ready to listen yet. To acknowledge this would mean to admit that something was wrong long ago. Today, I understand that these signs were not flaws nor exaggerations. They were messages. Messages from a life lived in too much silence. But at that time, I just endured it, believing that holding on was the same as living. That deep tiredness, that pent-up sadness, that feeling of always being on edge, all that was the price of not talking. A price I paid for many years, without knowing exactly why. The day something cracked didn't start any different from the others. It was an ordinary day, one of those that are repeated without leaving apparent marks. I followed my routine as always. Meeting schedules, solving small things, keeping everything in order. Nothing indicated that something inside me was about to change. It was a simple conversation that started it all. Nothing planned, nothing dramatic. Someone made an almost casual comment, a phrase said without deep intent. But that phrase found a sensitive place within me. For the first time in a long time, I couldn't ignore what I felt. The person asked me why I had never done something just for myself. The question was suspended in the air for a few seconds, and I did not know how to answer. Not because of shyness, but because there really was no answer. That hit me in an unexpected way. I tried to laugh, minimize, change the subject, but something had already been awakened. The question echoed in my head, repeating itself in silence. Why had I never done something just for myself? At what point had I stopped asking myself this? That day when I got home, the silence bothered me more than usual. I sat alone and felt a tightness in my chest that I couldn't shake off. For the first time, I didn't try to distract myself right away. I remained there, feeling. Memories began to emerge without me calling them. Decisions accepted, words swallowed, paths followed without reflection. It all appeared like pieces of a puzzle that I had never tried to put together, and little by little, the image began to make sense. The strongest feeling was not anger, nor immediate sadness. It was a surprise. Surprise to realize that perhaps I had not been weak, ungrateful, or incapable, as I had so often thought. Maybe I had just been conditioned to obey. This possibility scared me. Questioning this meant reviewing my entire history. It meant admitting that many things I carried as guilt might not be mine, and that was too big to ignore. I spent days restless after that. I slept badly, thought a lot, remembered old situations with a different look. Things that once seemed normal began to look strange. Phrases said in the past have gained new meanings. For the first time, I considered that my pain had an origin, that deep tiredness, that nameless guilt, that constant emptiness didn't come out of nowhere. They had been built up over time, decision after decision accepted in silence. It was not an immediate awakening. It was slow, uncomfortable, full of doubts. At times, I wanted to go back, pretend that nothing had happened. But something inside me had already moved, and there was no way to go back to the same place. That was the moment I realized something had cracked. Not on the outside, but on the inside. An old structure, made of obedience and silence, began to show cracks. And even though I was afraid, I knew I needed to look at it. That day didn't change everything at once, but it changed enough that I could never completely ignore the truth again. It was the beginning of a process that I had avoided for decades, and that even late began to free me. What comes now is the hardest part to share, because talking about it means touching something I've spent my whole life trying to protect. Telling this truth has a real emotional cost. It exposes pains that I've learned to hide even from myself. If you've come this far, it's because you understand that remaining silent also hurts. So subscribe to the channel, not as a support for me, but as a way to ensure that voices like this are not lost when they finally find the courage to speak up. After that day, the question began to accompany me in silence. What if I wasn't wrong? It did not come as a safe statement, but as an uncomfortable possibility. An idea that I avoided looking at directly, but that I insisted on coming back to whenever I was alone. For a long time, I was sure that the problem was with me. I was too sensitive, too weak, too confused. This explanation has always been convenient because it did not require changes. But little by little, I began to realize that perhaps this guilt had been learned, not deserved. I began to revisit my story with different eyes. Memories that once seemed normal now caused me strangeness. Phrases said naturally revealed control. Decisions made for my sake showed a lack of choice. All that was always there, but I had never allowed myself to see it. It was not easy to accept this new perspective. In many moments, I felt disloyal for thinking like that, as if questioning the past was a form of ingratitude. I spent my whole life believing that acknowledging pain was the same as accusing someone. But something inside me no longer accepted this logic. I could recognize what happened without turning it into an attack. I could look at my story honestly, without having to point blame. This idea began to bring me a shy relief. I realized that my obedience had not come out of nowhere. It was built, reinforced, praised. I was trained to accept, to give in, to shut up. Not because I wanted to disappear, but because I learned that this was the safest path. This realization did not erase the pain immediately. On the contrary, it brought a silent mourning. I mourned for the girl I couldn't choose, for the young woman who accepted without understanding, for the woman who spent years living on automatic. There were days when I wanted to deny all this, to say that there was no point in messing with the past, that it was too late. But the truth is that this question, what if I wasn't wrong, had already opened a door that could no longer be closed. I began to notice how I was still silent in the present, how he apologized unnecessarily, how it automatically avoided conflicts. The past was not as distant as I imagined. He was still alive in my gestures. Gradually, I allowed small internal changes. Not big decisions, not confrontations, just the permission to feel what I felt without judging myself immediately. This in itself was something new. This phase was marked by a lot of confusion. At times, I felt more lost than before. Questioning old patterns dismantles certainties that, even painful, gave some sense of stability. But along with the confusion came something I hadn't felt in a long time: curiosity. Curiosity about who I could have been, about who I could still be, even at that stage of life. Accepting the possibility that I wasn't wrong was a small step on the outside, but a huge one on the inside. It was the beginning of a silent, profound change that didn't need to be seen by anyone to be real. I still didn't know exactly what to make of this discovery, but for the first time, I stopped blaming myself automatically. And this was already a form of liberation. For a long time, I defined myself as strong. This word has always been associated with my story, said by other people and repeated by myself. They said that I could handle everything, that I didn't complain, that I was firm. I believed in it, because I had to believe it. It was the only explanation that made sense for so much renunciation. But as I began to look at my life more honestly, that idea began to unravel. I couldn't stand everything because I was strong. I endured it because I learned that there was no other option. That difference changed everything inside me. Being strong presupposes choice. It presupposes consciousness. And I began to realize that most of the time, I just reacted to what was imposed on me. There was no clear decision, just constant adaptation. That wasn't strength. It was conditioning. From an early age, I was trained to accept, not to contradict, not to bother. This training was so effective that it became invisible. I started to call virtue what, in fact, was emotional survival. This realization shook me deeply, because if it wasn't force, then what had it been? I had to face the fact that many of my attitudes did not come from courage, but from fear. Fear of displeasing, fear of being rejected, fear of being alone. At the same time, this discovery brought unexpected relief. For the first time, I stopped charging myself for not having reacted differently in the past. I did what was possible with what I knew at the time, and that didn't make me weak. Recognizing that I was trained to obey helped me understand why certain behaviors still came up automatically, because I apologized for no reason, because I avoided conflict even when I needed to speak. It was not a character flaw. It was an old habit. This understanding was not accompanied by anger. It came with sadness. Sadness for realizing how much of me was shaped to fit into small spaces. How much I adapted so as not to be a problem for anyone. There was also a silent mourning. I fight for the versions of me that never had a chance to exist. For the woman who could have been more spontaneous, freer, more whole. This grief hurt, but it was also necessary. For the first time, I was able to look at my history without judging myself, without trying to justify everything, just acknowledging what was. This brought a strange, almost uncomfortable, but true peace. I understood that my obedience did not completely define me. It shaped my behavior, but it didn't erase my essence. There was still something there, even after so many years of silence. This was the most profound turning point of all. There was no external confrontation, no grand declarations. There was only an internal adjustment, silent but definitive. I stopped calling myself weak inside. It was not strength, it was training. And understanding this has given me something I've never had before: compassion for myself. A compassion that requires no explanation, no permission. It was from that moment that I really began to free myself, even if in a discreet way, even if it's late, but still real. After understanding that it wasn't weakness, but training, I had to deal with what came next. There was no immediate desire to confront anyone, nor to revisit all the stories in search of external answers. What emerged was something quieter: the need to be honest with myself. For many years, I lived by telling a simplified version of my own story, a version that is easier to accept, less painful to sustain. I said that it had been like this because I wanted to, because it was better, because it was normal. Admitting that I had no choice at many times required courage. This honesty did not come all at once. It came in small internal confessions. Admitting that certain decisions have hurt me. Recognize that some situations made me feel trapped. Accepting that there were times when I wanted to say no, but I didn't know how. In some cases, I thought about talking to people from the past, to say what he never said. But I realized that this was not always necessary. Some people weren't ready to listen. Others might never understand, and that's okay. Not every truth needs to be told out loud to exist. The most important confrontation was not with others. It was me, with the version of me that learned to minimize its own pain to survive, with the woman who spent decades convincing herself that everything was okay when it wasn't. Telling myself the truth meant automatically stopping justifying everything. Stop saying that it wasn't that bad, or that it could have been worse. It was allowing my experience to have the size it always had, without comparisons. There were moments of deep sadness in this process. Sadness for the time that has passed, for the choices I didn't make, for the words I swallowed. But this sadness was different from the others. It was not accompanied by guilt. It was accompanied by clarity. I also had to accept that some people knew me only through the obedient version I offered, and that perhaps they were surprised by this internal change, even if discreet. Not everyone notices when someone starts to position themselves inside. I started making different little choices. Nothing radical, nothing visible. Only subtle attitudes of respect for myself. Allow myself to rest without guilt. Saying no when something weighed me down too much. To be silent when I really wanted silence, and not out of fear. These small changes brought discomfort at first. The habit of obeying was still strong. Sometimes I felt wrong for prioritizing myself, but little by little, this feeling began to diminish. I was learning something new, even late. There was no complete deliverance, no perfect ending. There was an adjustment, an internal repositioning that allowed me to breathe more lightly. I didn't change the past, but I changed the way it lived inside me. Telling the truth, even if only for me, was an act of respect that I had never practiced. It was recognizing my own story without filters, without excuses, without fear. And that, in itself, has already been transformative. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. He no longer needed to sustain an image. For the first time, I allowed myself to exist without explaining myself all the time. This chapter did not close everything, but it set the stage for something new, something simple but essential. To live the time I have left with more awareness and less silence. Today, when I look back on my entire life, I no longer see it as a sequence of wrong decisions made out of weakness. I see a trajectory shaped by expectations, silences, and learnings that I never questioned. Understanding this does not erase what I experienced, but it completely changes the way this story weighs inside me. For a long time, the idea of lost time haunted me. I believed that certain discoveries only had value when made early. That understanding too late was almost useless. But I realized that this was just another way to silence myself. Time does not invalidate the truth. It only changes the way the truth arrives. In old age, we begin to realize that not all liberation comes with rupture. Some come with acceptance. Others with an honest tiredness of pretending that everything is fine. In my case, liberation came when I stopped fighting my own story and began to listen to it with more kindness. I didn't rewrite my past. I didn't undo choices. I didn't correct paths. But I stopped punishing myself for them. I came to understand that I did the best I could with the tools I had, and that was enough. Not perfect, but human. Today, my silence is different. It no longer comes from fear, nor from the obligation to please. It comes from choice. I choose to keep quiet when I don't want to explain. I choose to speak up when something matters to me. This difference, as subtle as it may seem, changed everything. There are still days when old habits appear. The impulse to give in, to justify myself, to put myself in the background has not completely disappeared. He still lives in me, but now I recognize it. And recognizing is already a kind of freedom. I learned that listening to yourself takes practice. At first, it's uncomfortable. It seems selfish. It seems wrong. But little by little, this listening turns into care. A care that I never had with myself for most of my life. Today, I'm slower, more selective, more aware of my limits. I don't do things anymore just to maintain an image. I don't strive to be seen as strong all the time. I learned that resting is also a right, not a prize. If there is something that I would like those who listen to this story to understand, it is that accepting everything in silence exacts too high a price. Even when it seems easier, even when it seems to avoid conflict, the body remembers, the mind guards, and the bill arrives sooner or later. Control disguised as care confuses. Imposed silence becomes a habit. And living trying to match all the time erases important parts of who we are. I lived like this for decades thinking it was normal. It wasn't. I don't say that in anger. I say it lucidly. Because it wasn't until I stopped blaming myself that I was able to look back without constant pain. Today there is sadness, yes. But there is also understanding. And this completely changes the weight of the memories. Maybe I didn't live all the possibilities that life offered, but I still live something very valuable. The truth. A simple truth. Without spectacle, but profoundly liberating. The truth of recognizing myself as someone who deserved to be heard. I accepted orders without understanding the consequences. That shaped my story. But understanding these consequences, even late, changed my present. Some truths wait a lifetime to be faced, and even when they reach the end of the road, still matter. If this story touched you on any level, please share this video. It's not just an individual experience. It speaks of silent patterns that cut across families, generations, and entire cultures. By sharing, you don't spread a video. You help break cycles for someone who may not yet know that they can speak. I'll stay here reading each comment carefully. Tell me, from which city or country you are watching this, and what of this story has stayed with you? Your words really matter to me.